listener production.
Hello, welcome to this episode of The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Vladimir Putin has secured another 6 years in power in Russia. It's not a surprise. The vote, which took place over the weekend, was well and truly stacked to ensure his victory. So what do we know about this sham election and the man himself? And what does the future hold for Putin? Joining me now is Politico journalist Zoya Sheftalovich. Zoya, Vladimir Putin's been re-elected. Tell us how he's run this election to ensure he came back into power.
Vladimir Putin wasn't just re-elected, he was re-elected with his highest vote share ever. So he looks to be set to win around about 88% of the vote with a 73% or so turnout. So that is pretty unprecedented. It's dictator figures. So I think actually the funny thing is that he might be somewhat disconcerted by how high that vote share is, because when we've seen dictators with rigged elections elsewhere, such as Belarus in 2020, they dare not get over the 80% mark because it just looks so suspicious. But in terms of how he got here, I mean, he eliminated every trace of opposition that existed. He either killed or imprisoned or sent into exile anyone who might have given him any sort of run for his money. We had the death of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, a few weeks ago in an Arctic prison colony. We had the barring from the election of the two anti-war candidates who attempted to run. And essentially, the election was a choice between Putin and three nobodies the Kremlin put on the ballot and who had zero policies that differed. In fact, they didn't have any policies at all. It's not even that they differed or didn't differ from Putin. And they never criticized Putin. They never debated. So it was a complete sham election, and the only real opposition that exists is now outside of the country or dead.
We heard talk of a few protest actions that took place during the election, which lasted 3 days. We heard of a number of fire bombings. Old women, I read, pouring paint into ballot boxes, and also the midday turnout that was spurred on by Navalny's widow, Yulia. And she said, everyone turn out to polling places around the world at the same time. Let's make these big, long queues. These are obviously minor protests in the grand scheme of things, what we might look at in the West and go, oh, they're small actions. How big is it, though, in Russia for any sort of protest action to take place?
It's really, really significant because the reason we saw, for instance, the older women who were pouring ink into ballot boxes and setting fire to polling stations is because it's a symbol of the fact that if you are a younger person, the chances are that you're going to get locked up for life or sent to a penal colony, and the risk of that sort of protest is extremely high. It's actually not an unprecedented thing in Russia where the older women or women in general protest. So we saw a few protests break out over the past year or so of women protesting against mobilization of men to fight in Ukraine. And so this is continuing on that track. There was the noon protest on Sunday where Navalny himself, Alexei Navalny, wrote just a few weeks before he was killed in the penal colony, wrote a message on social media saying that it would be an interesting way of protesting for everyone to come at noon on Sunday. And we did see crowds gathering around the world, but also within Russia at noon on Sunday. Some of those people, it was the only way to show that there was some degree of dissent, that there was some degree of protest and of anti-Putin sentiment within Russia as well as outside of Russia. And we saw queues forming all over. But the fact is that most people voted on Friday. The Kremlin machine forced basically a very large number of people to vote. So we know that students and civil servants and various other people were essentially forced to the polls on Friday through fear of punishment. Anyone who was working for the public service had to show that they had voted already when they came to work on Friday. The protests that broke out on Sunday were significant in that they did show that there is still some dissent within the country, but not so significant that it significantly challenges Putin.
Does Putin have any genuine support within Russia?
He absolutely does. There is a very large proportion of Russians who don't see any issues with Putin, or if they do see some issues, they still credit him for turning the country around after the perestroika era, when a lot of them were financially hit very, very hard. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the capital reforms started coming through, there was hyperinflation. There were shortages of everything, really. People were hungry. There was a humiliation of Russia in many ways, or people saw it as a humiliation of Russia, as the economy was shown to be built on a house of cards, and as the country was shown to have not actually had the strength that people thought it did as a rival superpower to the US during the Cold War. So there is a definite level of support for Putin. It's hard to tell how high that support is because there is not real polling in Russia that can be done. People don't trust pollsters. Even if you have an independent pollster like Levada during the years when they were able to operate with some degree of independence, people are afraid when they get a phone call from someone saying that they're from an independent pollster. No one is going to be telling a so-called independent pollster on the phone what they really think of the regime. So it's very difficult to know.
Let's talk about Putin's rise to power. How did he get to the position that he is in right now?
It's been a long time in the making. Putin came out of nowhere a little bit back in 1999 when he was essentially chosen as the anointed successor to Yeltsin. He was chosen as Yeltsin's prime minister. There was a jostling for power among Yeltsin's inner circle, and Putin kind of came out of left field. There were a lot of people who are much higher profile, much more popular, much more well-known among Russians and among Yeltsin's circle. But the decision was made to install Putin as Yeltsin's prime minister. And in the wake of that installation of Putin, who was from the KGB, so he had spent many, many years as a member of the KGB, the Russian secret spy agency, effectively, a secret service. So he had this real murky background. And when he came and suddenly sort of appeared as this prime minister in 1999, people were a bit confused. He wasn't well known. He wasn't much of a contender. And then there was this spate of apartment bombings around Moscow where a number of apartment blocks had bombs placed into their basements and people died in bomb explosions. And at the time, Putin launched this huge crackdown. As prime minister, he blamed Chechens for those apartment bombings and basically swore that he would get these people wherever they were and made a bunch of arrests, did a big kind of push on law and order, and was re-elected a few months later when Putin, he wasn't re-elected, he was elected for the first time a few months later when Yeltsin stood down on New Year's Eve in 1999. And that is how we got Putin in power. And since then, he's been tightening his grip on power. He's been president. There was a term limit for presidencies. He changed that term limit so that he was able to run. He switched with Medvedev, who was his prime minister, who became the president, in order to reset that clock. So he's just kept his grip on power in every way possible, originally seeking to do so in a way that was in line with the Constitution by doing that swap, and then eventually just changing the Constitution when it became apparent that he was going to do it again. So he's repressed all dissent. He has gotten rid of any independent media that existed in Russia. He has essentially created a situation where it is a Kremlinocracy, where you've got essentially one man controlling all of the money, all of the people. Anyone who steps out of line either gets exiled or killed. And that's how you get to a state of Russia being where it is now. It's essentially a regime where only one man really holds the power.
Why did he bother going through a sham election when everyone knew the result before anyone had even cast a ballot?
It's important because Putin has always found legitimacy or sought legitimacy at the ballot box. And generally, when you've got dictators, dictators always like to hold an election because it shows some degree of legitimacy in their government, particularly when they can get rid of any opposition. It's different now than it was in Stalinist times. In Stalinist times, there was just the one name on the ballot when you went to cast it. But it is effectively the same because you've got 3 Kremlin-approved stooges as the only opposition on the ballot paper for Putin. But there is a degree of legitimacy that he seeks at the ballot box, and particularly with a result that is so significantly in his favor, though I do think that with this 88% support, he's really overshot the mark.
Look, Putin has essentially guaranteed that he will be in power until he dies. He made changes to the constitution in 2020 that would allow him to run for 2 more 6-year terms. That gets us up to 2036. He'll be 84 by then. What happens when he dies? Is he bringing up successors with him that are going to carry on his legacy? You know, has he got that plan in place, or is he so focused on power now that he's not looking to the future?
The problem for Putin is that over the years, he has had anointed successors, people who looked like they might be positioning themselves or he might be positioning them to take power from him. But every time that has happened, he has cut them down. I think because they got too popular or they appeared to be some level of threat to his power and to his support, he would get rid of them. And so there was a string of these people who have come and gone, who he has pushed into sort of political exile. So there isn't really anyone who is in a position to take over from Putin. He cannot cede power if the person who succeeds him may, in some world, give him up for the ICC because he is facing an international arrest warrant over the child abductions that Russia oversaw during and continues to oversee during the war in Ukraine. He could be tried for corruption, considering the huge amount of corruption that occurs and really all stems from the very, very top. And this was actually why Alexei Navalny was so dangerous to Putin, because he was revealing some of that corruption. He was revealing the insides of Putin's palaces. He was revealing the amount of money that Putin and his cronies were secreting away from the state. So these are really, really dangerous things. And that's why it's going to be very difficult for Putin to cede power in any way until he's dead, because it effectively means that he could find himself living out his golden years in a prison somewhere or in The Hague. I think it's much more likely that he holds on until he's dead or until someone removes him. And whether anyone ever has the power to be able to do that is a question.
Zoya, it's always very enlightening talking to you. You have so much information about this. We appreciate you taking us through it on The Briefing today.
Thank you very much.
That is all from us at The Briefing today. Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode engaging or interesting or both, we'd love if you could share it with someone you know. And wherever you're listening to us, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Bension and I will be back tomorrow morning at 6 with the headlines and another deep dive. See you then.